Hello all, and to introduce this video essay, I am presupposing that you either watched my last video on Alistair Macintyre's After Virtues, or you know a thing or two about Alistair Macintyre and his project with the virtues. And so I would highly recommend checking that out before watching this video, because I'm going to be presupposing and ultimately in this video doing a sort of Macintyrean hermeneutics over not just his following of Aristotle, but my own. And so this is kind of an old school footnotes video on the channel that old people are going to notice some of the tie-ins here to a lot of my earlier videos. Of course, I've mentioned how influential Macintyre and this project was for me at the start of this channel, and so we're kind of returning to form here. And so one of the concepts, of course, that I want to discuss and has been discussed ad nauseum in the scene, if you will, is Macintyre's sort of search for what you would call a minoritarian strategy. And I think one of the lead-ins to this, of course, is the idea of practice and knowledge within disciplines. Of course, in his example, he puts forth a really straightforward and easy to understand example of teaching an adolescent chess and rewarding them with some sort of treat. And of course, one could point out to how a child might cheat to get a certain result to warrant such a reward. Of course, in the modern world, we think of simply participation, and of course, that's not really gaining knowledge necessarily on an eternalized basis of actually being able to have prudence in a practice or a discipline in a field of knowledge, as we'll get into. And so, clearly, as a former Marxist, Macintyre has a project of trying to really get away from the modern world, modern liberalism. Capitalism, of course, is something he's antithetical to. And so you can see that Macintyre, he has the project, and some have critiqued that he doesn't go far enough. Of course, a man is only given one life, and he's near 90 now. So, as he's went on his own intellectual journey, you can't really blame him for as he got older and got into these ideas, he didn't offer as much up towards an actual formulation of what this would actually look like in practice, although he does in his very late works at the turn of the century. And so picking up on that ends, you can see that actually gaining knowledge of a discipline in its practice is and often can be antithetical towards the institutions that even arrange such a discipline to begin with. Institutions mainly are concerned with the means of simply enacting themselves or putting themselves forward. And so, an institution of, and certainly as you get more bureaucratized and more dependency on it, It really has to have that managerial aspect of just trying to justify its own power and expansion. And so this can be antithetical to one's practice in actually gaining knowledge. And I think, there's something to be said about education and the education of millions of people, and sometimes millions that aren't even accounted for, certainly in American politics, as a problem right now. And so the state or the ends for an education requires a sort of malaise, if you will, of a real education as compared to what could be had. And so they're merely concerned with their own resources and power and justification more than the actual eternal goodness, which is something that's very problematic and ultimately is something that needs to be addressed for any sort of dissident theory that wants to come into power. But this look at practice and the internal wisdom or gaining of prudence, if you will, in the virtues, as compared to the attainment of power, because these things aren't necessarily the same, as we just demonstrated here with how one may be inclined to climb the institutional ladder in external goods, the big house, the wife, the sports car, whatever the case may be. And you can certainly not just see that in everyday people with, my job is just, something to put food on the table. My practice isn't as important as, getting these external goods. And many times these can actually, come from, not just a sort of hedonistic aspect, but trying to make do with, a shift, as Macintyre would point out, from actually being orientated morally in a society towards fatherhood of the house and markets in a more Aristotelian sense, that going back on some of my critiques of capital as compared to markets. That sort of telos is far different from what Macintyre would say in emotive modernity, where there's capital competition for resources, but there's no actual telos about it. And so looking around in the scene, and of course some of the things that are people are interested or care about within the scene, you can perhaps look with this fresh pair of insight here with are we actually looking for power and goods and gaining knowledge eternally, or are we more worried about external goods? And obviously there and I think as we'll get on with the video, there has to be a sort of harmony towards this. And of course, in an ideal society that a dissident would want, this would be as close to as normal as or as close to the ideal, to the concrete actual action within the world as possible. But I also think that if we were going to discuss culturally with men and their sort of directionlessness that we see, especially with young men, one of the things I think in the emotivist culture that Macintyre critiques is in this competitive landscape and this focus on the externals, then you are building resentment within a community, because many people think that simply, and especially true with Marxists and postmodernists, that man takes umbrage with the rejection of a hierarchical direction or material status, again on that external goods basis. But hypothetically, and something that you could perhaps observe, if you really think about it in the real world, when you get one-upped by someone in a skill or a practice, even something as minor as a game of chess, even if you're just simply bested by another man from his own practice, there's far less need for resentment than actually feeling as if you are being cheated or being undercut and not actually being looked at for your internal goods, and just again focused on only the external glorification. And so that's an important distinction to perhaps make as well, with being against really what I like to call emotivist algorithms, where one's identity in the emotivist culture can really branch out in all these different directions of resentment. And of course, just like on the internet with any scene, you do have manipulators, as Macintyre would discuss, these emotivist manipulators, towards just focused on the external goods instead of the flourishing and letting of people in the internal goods. And so you can see that there is definitely a character aspect within the dissidents on the internet of emotivists in disguise, or even outright, who are simply trying to gain their own status, game into the institution, or change who they are to capitulate to external goods, as opposed to the internal ones. And of course, this isn't easy, and this isn't the ends either, as we'll get into. You need much more than just what you could actually even argue is the sort of Nietzschean way to go about it, of if I am asserting my own practice and I can attain my own practical knowledge or my practical wisdom in a discipline, and just totally dominate it, and be on the outside looking in. Of course, that I think in a lot of ways is pointed out to in the virtues text about being inferior, maybe not on the intellectual basis, of course, but and actually participating in a community. And clearly, of course, with a reading of Aristotle, one of the ways the virtues is done, of course, is the practicality of your discipline being shared towards the community end. And so, ultimately you do need to try to either, of course, as we're trying to do, influence institutions, or be creative in our own capacity towards these sort of things. And so one of the interesting things that I would think about when I was looking at Macintyre's text, especially with his character descriptions of the emotivist culture in its manipulation, in the manager, or the emotivist, if you will, certainly has a necessary need to control or frame how algorithms and what sort of reactions one could get out of particular content consumed on the internet at any given time. And so, of course, this becomes very important in the emotivist culture, in the managerial class, to try to frame resentments perhaps in a certain way, manipulate how mind states could potentially be, even convince people that they are actually approaching this on a more rational plane. But in the end, this is only just preference, only just emotion, and a manipulative one at that. And one of the things that algorithms do that anyone who's ever used the internet can kind of see is it kind of becomes recursive, and you just keep running into these same subjects over and over again as you continue to look at these same subjects over and over again. So you're just constantly feeding back into that, and so of course this can be manipulated by the manager then, and so this is like I think when I do another generalities video, that'll be one of the main points. Is it certainly seems as the right, as the sort of out party, if you will, the one who always has to come to the table, come to the compromise of what the state is looking to change or do at any time, then trying to work the framing for the expansion of bureaucracy in their mind states is, of course, the utmost importance in an emotivist culture. And so using social media and putting that into this text here, I think, is really important and kind of really describes our world today and how we can hopefully combat that. I also wanted to dive into his characterization of psychiatry or the psychologist, and I think one of, as we've, and this is not a new observation here by any stretch, but as we've seen in an increasingly secular society that we are inhibiting, and the fall of theology, one of the interesting things to see is the what Derrida would call the supplement of confession, talking and being renewed after confessing sins because you've disobeyed divinity, in that relationship, as compared to the modern psychiatry state, where by removing any assertion of what is the good life as compared to the more theological representation of it, then you see that human end in action then can only be administered in the behavioral state, and only in perspective. And so one of the unsatisfying things I think you will find with psychologists, not just the the patients, but psychologists themselves, because ultimately many psychologists are simply into the field because they wanted to reframe their own mind states, and so there's a sort of presupposition necessary in order to do and be into psychology and the psychological domain. And so it's an interesting character to see the priest fall to the wayside, and that idea of redemption even as compared to the justifications of psychology and simply how to feel within a mind state. There's no actual direction towards the good life or any sort of morality, but it's simply just the justification, and also the need to bend the mental capacity towards the actual discipline itself and its presuppositions, as opposed to the traditional way of confession. And so, moving along here, I wanted to also discuss race and of Macintyre's shift from somewhat, I wouldn't say outright rejection of Aristotelian biology that you can see throughout the virtues start to develop as he continues along this path of resurrecting Aristotelian traditions. And so, looking at Macintyre himself and his own critiques, why Marxism wasn't sufficient, or why I think in today's world, leftism isn't sufficient for a racial consciousness, if you will, is because ultimately it's a faux path just towards the expansion of the manager. There is no narrative crafting or proper historicism that actually has been put forward. And as he points out, many of the Marxists, even when they obtained power, ended up just deferring to liberalism or some sort of utilitarian ethic, and of course, as he points out, there really is no moral framework anymore beyond just emotive preference, because there's no historical narrative anymore. And so, putting that all together, this is, really me jumping forward to, what I want to actually take away from this, and this is to bring in the biological aspect of Aristotelian metaphysics towards, a racial discussion. As Macintyre points, universality in morality paradoxically fails because you need, particulars in that proper historical framework for narrative in order to actually have a cohesive moral picture. Otherwise, you just have these different abstract rules that you don't actually understand the telos of it. You don't understand, why these taboos are the way they are, like the Polynesians example. And so I'm trying to, put forth that, the rational soul in that Aristotelian sense, requires that bounding of a biological people towards the relationship in their environments. And so one of the examples that I've done, and it's the most popular video I ever did on YouTube, was when I did that mishmash video of Dragon Ball Z and the Super Saiyan, and it's a lore to Mexicans and South America in particular, and because this is a trace back to actually our own stories, because those stories actually, or those characters actually rubbed off on Imperial Japan to begin with. And so one of the reasons I've pointed to, and I think that is, and as you see with the Latino demographic and the representation in boxing, and the higher altitude and the old Aztec tradition of neighborhood, cult fighters literally being brought forth in their youth to fight competitively against each other. And just as the saying, in the fight, he gains power, and so just like for the Aztecs, that the fight itself, has that sort of recognition of power, of heroism, and we see this sort of self-reflection of that Derridian trace, if you will, in hypermodernity, where you have these little pieces, as the allegory goes with the sciences in a post-science world, where you're finding these little causal rules for a scientific picture, and hypermodernity definitely embodies that, with how you have all of these moral systems and these different civilizations that we're always discussing, and we're picking apart this and picking apart that, but many times we actually do come across some of these stories that actually came to us because of our biology, in being a rational soul. And so, as he goes on with his career, Macintyre slowly, I think, comes around to this, process that, or at least thinking of, actually, even though Aristotle wasn't necessarily so explicit with his sciences and biology as compared to, looking at the politics or something like that, ultimately, though, there was a sort of, unsaid cohesiveness toward that picture, and how the rational soul could be differed. And so, another example was, and this also can happen, within the arts, in a way that's not just simply known on an intellectual basis from the start. Another example is how, when Stan Lee is in the Northeast, creating these Marvel characters, the properties and many of these ideas are actually because he's looking off into the Appalachia, into the natives, and so you see they actually have these same properties, and even pluralistic notions of many gods, and many different powers and properties within them, and there's a similarity towards native myths. That's because these environments collaborate with the creative ingenuity of us practicing as rational souls. If I was going to put a bow on that. And so, how one's rationality and tradition is anchored by his, place and time, of course, is easily asserted within, on an intellectual basis within philosophy, but many have, forgotten about the biological and environmental aspects. And so, just like with the example of the Latino fighter and affinity towards the story of the Super Saiyan, if you take away the mountain ranges, you might not have the same story to come out of that. But to continue to build on this, though, and discuss this, when you look at face physiognomy, many of these classifications comes from the use of being in a language game within a community. If we're going to go down an analytic philosophy route, because of the way words are spoken within the language, will attribute to their face. So this may seem rather incidental and superficial, but things like this are happening all the time towards our environment, and how we are actually placed in the world and our perceptions of it, and thus paradoxically the particularness necessary as a moral agent towards a rational universal ethic that can be bounding. And so a discussion of racial consciousness and how morality in its cohesive picture requires not just the intellectual basis, of course, but concreted with the peripherals of one's biology to the rational soul. And one of the thinkers that inspired me the most, and I did that old video on harmony and race, is the way Carl Jung would talk about the human body and its timelessness. That our organs are like that of a time machine, and there's a story to go with that, and not just the story of your rationality or your hero story or your story of a community's people, but how that story actually comes out or comes into being from your actual organs that have been passed down onto you through these classifications of race, biology, and environment. And so this is why I think the so-called neo-Marxist view of history and contemporary times of seeing this colonizer consciousness, but as many have pointed out before, in this history that relies on these on the judgments and the following the process of the action of material possessions, presupposed the material framework that the Faustian Western man brought forth. And so this is again why contemporary history doesn't really work in that sense, because the so-called colonizer didn't just stumble onto material goods or resources, but there's a creative aspect within them, or within the human condition at large, towards the material, and an attitude and a social awareness towards that. And so that's why you're ultimately just presupposing that that Western tradition, even though they're saying that they're not. And so that's another critique that you could look at and perhaps evolve with this video. And so, again, there's that sort of harmony or reciprocation or dialectic even with one's environment and one's people's creative capacity in itself. And as Spengler would point, the European Northwest looked at material goods with gravity and force and atomization, which of course it's always interesting to point out that the atom wasn't found interesting at all to the Greeks, even though it was discovered, but it was just quickly forgotten because it wasn't of interest to them. It didn't embark on that particular civilization. And finally, I wanted to put a bow on this commentary video and put forth to you all that the virtue of hope. And many times I see without the seeing the constant disparity of our times, and obviously in many regards they are absolutely correct, but the virtue of hope and of courage is fundamental towards not just any sort of aspiration you might have personally, and of course to express in external goods as we've discussed earlier, but in how one might go forward and trying to escape emotivist cultures and trying to actually preserve their community, preserve their racial history, as I've put forth as well, and to continue that need for hope, and how hope and of course courage really lays forth to any sort of action, any sort of movement in this process of trying to pull the levers of modern modern power politics in a direction that's more towards either the virtues or whatever the aspiration may be. But I've gone on long enough, and hope you guys like this video. It's kind of a ramble, but yeah, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.